Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome to an analytical discussion about the state under a neoliberal oligarchy, with a special focus on the United States, especially given the considerable press as well as political debate and a rhetoric, to some degree populist, about the issue of the state under the control of an oligarchy, an ancient Greek word which means rule by the few. There is the question, of course, and a legitimate one, especially for people like me, a former university professor who taught a number of courses on civilizations across the globe. There is the question whether any state from ancient Mesopotamia, 3,500 BC, to the present, has ever been anything but under a hierarchical socioeconomic and sociopolitical order. There is a question of whether, and a philosophical one that the great 20th century existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre raised with regard to elites, whether any state has ever operated outside the confines of an elite structure. That's a legitimate question. Now, the fact is that the theories of the state since the nascent phase of the capitalist world system in the 15th century, from Niccolo Machiavelli, whose work, The Prince, remains a very important philosophical study on what is the role of the state in the 16th century during the transition from the feudal manorial era to the capitalist system, to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, in the early 17th century, an English philosopher, to John Locke in the late part of the 17th century, the father of Western liberalism, pondering the same question, what is the role of the state? And then, of course, Marx and Engels in the 19th century, looking at the role of the state in terms of a class-based system and the means of production, to the 20th century, down to the neoliberal period of individuals like Hayek and Friedman, apostles, two of the major thinkers of the neoliberal era. All of them have dealt with this issue: what is the role of the state? And of course, all of them made assumptions, from Machiavelli to Friedman, about human nature and about what constitutes the ideal society. So one of the issues, however, on which all of them agree is the criteria of legitimacy and credibility. The state must have legitimacy. Now, in the era of absolutism, in the era of Niccolo Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, even Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, legitimacy, as far as the absolute monarchs of Europe were concerned, emanated from a divine source, from God. Obviously, as we move forward in time, legitimacy emanates from the governed, and a concept that John Locke, the 17th century liberal philosopher, introduced during the Glorious Revolution. That is, legitimacy of the state emanates from the governed, not the government. The government receives the stamp of approval from the people. The question is, which people, and are there elites within that category of the people as John Locke. I'm just using the term he uses. And the question is, are there elites within the people that determine state policy, that determine the social contract, broadening this out a little bit? And even further, by the time we come to the 19th century, to Marx and Engels, is it the means of production? Is it the social structure, the division of labor, that the political economy that determines the role of the state in society? So those are questions that are important, along with the issue of credibility. At what point does the state have at least enough credibility so that it doesn't constantly resort to force, that is, becomes utterly authoritarian, tyrannical, as to use again the word tyranny, the word that John Locke, the liberal philosopher, used. And it simply rules by consensus. At least there is enough consensus on the part of the population, granted most of them docile, accepting the status quo as such as it is, globally, by the way, and just going along to survive day by day. But at what point does the status quo become unbearable so that the population loses faith? The state lacks credibility, and then the state fears the population and becomes more tyrannical and resorts to policies that are even more repressive towards specific groups, making them a scapegoat, or broadly speaking, more groups towards society as a whole, in order to preserve the oligarchic control of state and the status quo. The privileged orders, as during this term became very famous during the French Revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 was about the 97% of the population, as the Abbé Sieyès wrote in What is the Third Estate, that 97%, which was the middle class and the working class, and the peasants and the serfs and so forth, versus the privileged orders, namely the nobility and the clergy, especially obviously the upper clergy. And now we don't have that, but we have the capitalist class, the billionaire class, as Senator Bernie Sanders in the United States keeps saying, the billionaire class versus society. At what point does the state become tyrannical in its policies on a wide scale to the degree that it loses credibility by the majority of the people, as they recognize that the social contract is designed to buttress the privileged orders at the expense of the vast majority of the population? This is the issue that I want to address today, and I'm addressing it partly because in mid-May, the President of the United States went to the Middle East, to three countries: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, and he took along with him, by the way, a number of billionaires to strike deals with the wealthy, utterly conservative, authoritarian, in other words, authoritarian Gulf states, and to strike deals on behalf of these people, as well as, of course, use the office to enrich the presidential family. This is an issue that came up in the Washington Post. By the way, recently there was a very important piece on how this administration, that is the Trump administration, is remaking Washington, D.C., and by extension, American society, using public office for private gain. This is an issue that was very prevalent during the first Trump administration, and again, it's now prevalent. Yeah, but wider than that, the question is, and especially as far as I'm concerned for this particular session, what is the role beyond Trump, by the way, of the state? And is Trump really the issue here, or is it a systemic problem that it's been building up for decades, from Reagan to the present, in fact, under the neoliberal model? Just briefly, by the way, because I have done a great deal of work on neoliberalism, the neoliberalism is an ideology emerging in the interwar era in the late 1930s, during the Great Depression and the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. It was a reaction against not just the Bolshevik Revolution and the so-called communist threat, the Red Scare in that period, but also against Keynesian policies, that is named after John Maynard Keynes, who, by the way, had his own theory of the state. John Maynard Keynes, with whom many associate the American New Deal, but actually there are versions of that on a world scale. If you look at Keynesian politics, Keynesian political economy models, rather, variations of it all over the world since the 1930s. So neoliberalism does mean doesn't have anything to do, doesn't have much to do, I shouldn't say anything, doesn't have much to do with John Locke's and Adam Smith's classical neoliberal philosophy. It has more to do in the capitalist class using the state to buttress the capitalist class and transfer income from the bottom up, from the working class and the middle class to the wealthy, to strengthen society because through derivative effects of capitalism, in theory, by the way. So what we have is deregulation is one of the pillars of neoliberalism. Low taxation, all of these things, by the way, right now, governments all over the world, led by the United States, are pursuing. Corporate subsidies, transfer money from social welfare programs. In the United States right now, there's a bill in Congress, 4.5 trillion in tax cuts, gifts to the wealthiest Americans. And some of that it will be taken out of Medicaid. Close to 1 trillion is the debate in the House and the Senate, of course, just recently reveals. So you take out money from Medicaid. Now we have to remember who receives Medicaid. It is the poorest Americans, by the way. They're the ones who receive Medicaid. It's for health, for their health. And taking money out of that and putting it into the pockets of the wealthiest individuals. To their credit, a few hundred of them did sign a letter, open letter to, they published it. I don't remember if it was the New York Times op-ed piece or some other news organization, but they published an open letter saying, don't do this to the Trump administration. We don't need this money. Put it in the economy, strengthen the economy overall. Don't give it to us directly. In any event, be that as it may, there is the question, of course, of scholarly works, and there have been many on the issue of the state under oligarchy. Recently, the Harvard Kennedy School published a study by two authors of the institution entitled "Oligarchy in the Open." So it's not, to their credit, these scholars from the Kennedy School at Harvard recognized that oligarchy was always there, but behind the scenes. And that is true, by the way, if you look at the history of how elites have been behind the scenes, whether under capitalism or in the feudal manorial period, or going back to the classical period. The elites were always there. The theoretical model of government, theoretical social contract notwithstanding, promising all sorts of things, equality and fairness and social justice, putting that aside, the reality is there is a recognition by serious scholars like these people here that the elites have always been behind the state. The state has been the domain of the elites. Okay. The question for this particular study at Harvard is, well, what's next? Where do we go from here? What kind of society are we building? And now Harvard is an interesting situation because, and this is why I said earlier, the question here is not about Trump. In my view, this is a structural issue, an institutional issue. The fact is that the state has been evolving toward a neoliberal elite model and control of the state by the elites, by Wall Street firms, by billionaires, and especially during the Trump period, but even Biden, by Silicon Valley, in the name of progress and technology, adopting artificial intelligence to modernize the bureaucracy. This is the argument that the Elon Musk group, the Doge group, used to gut the bureaucracies, in some cases, eliminate agencies. In the name of what? Giving Silicon Valley and various other firms, including banks, by the way, and consulting firms, hundreds of billions of dollars looking ahead in government contracts. So making a labor-intensive federal bureaucracy capital-intensive at the expense of the taxpayer. This is important because this means that the federal bureaucracy is now both benefiting more directly the capitalist class, as like I said, in this case, especially Silicon Valley. Trump has been especially focused on them, okay? Looking at the inauguration, who was around him, looking at the fact that he brought Musk inside the White House, looking at who were the people that the president took with him in the entourage in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, looking at those people, looking at the contracts signed. It was mostly Silicon Valley contracts signed by the Gulf states, as well as defense, by the way, defense industries and Silicon Valley. Looking at all of that, the control of the state handed over by the political class, an elected individual. Trump wasn't imposed by anyone. He was elected. The American people elected him, fair and square. The question is, how did we get here? Is it because Trump did something magical? Actually, the foundations of this are slow and gradual, and we can see both Republicans and Democrats getting to this point. And the reason that I cited the Harvard study is because during the Biden administration, the state, that is the government of the Biden administration, going to adopting a forever war doctrine and going into a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. And by the way, Russia did invade Ukraine, no doubt about it, for its own geopolitical reasons, citing the expansion of NATO eastward and a threat to its national security. But putting that aside, the fact is that during the Biden administration, that war combined with Israel's war in Gaza against civilians, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, as well as the United Nations, various agencies and representatives of the rapporteurs in the United Nations clearly state this. This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of empirical data, empirical evidence. So what we have here is the Biden administration going along with the oligarchy, which, by the way, the president himself, President Joe Biden, on his way out the door of the White House, gave a speech. He wanted to emulate the great general of World War II, who later became president, Dwight Eisenhower, when he, 1961, when he went out the door of the White House, he cautioned the American people, American society, about the military-industrial complex. So here comes Joe Biden, who all along had been tool, if you will, the front man, the man who carried the day for Wall Street and Silicon Valley and the oligarchy. And at the very last moment, he comes out and warns the American people about the state being taken over by the oligarchy. Okay? This is after, of course, he was leaving and Trump was taking over. Now, is that true? Absolutely. There is no doubt. There is absolutely no doubt. And what is disturbing, as the Harvard study pointed out, is that it's out in the open, and that the Trump administration, the media, Wall Street, mainstream institutions want to make this the norm. They want to tell the American people, live with it. This is the new norm. The open control of society by the oligarchy. Your government, presumably democratic, is now under oligarchy control. And this is how we're going to redefine democracy. Democracy is being redefined. Now, Harvard, under Biden, had its problems because all universities abide by academic freedom principles and respect the Constitution and freedom of speech. The First Amendment, they respect that. The previous president of Harvard was ousted by a combination of pressure from the Biden White House and Wall Street, billionaires who were pro-Israel in the war executed against the Palestinians in Gaza. Okay? An American Jewish professor takes over, Oligarchy, and the Trump administration goes after him and uses the power of money against Harvard. Using, by the way, the pretext of anti-Semitism, although Garber is Jewish, by the way. And of course, that I don't know how far that's going to go. But the fact is that this premier institution, not just in the United States, but Harvard is a very important institution globally. And it has an international faculty, and it has an international student body. Under the narrow nationalistic anti-immigrant America First anti-cultural diffusion trend of the administration, the Trump administration, the institutions like Harvard, who have historically, and it's not just Harvard, all major institutions in the United States, we have historically relied on cultural diffusion. That is the fact that there are faculty, there is a talent coming from all over the world to enrich science and technology and culture in America and enrich the minds of students, and students coming to get educated and in turn provide a contribution to the creativity of American society. That has been under attack. So the Oligarchy in the Open article by Harvard's Kennedy School is very important in this respect. Now, all of this comes at a time that the United States, under Trump, has recognized very openly, just like the oligarchy is out in the open now behind the state, it has recognized very openly that the United States is indeed in an irreversible decline, losing the core status in the world economy to China and the BRICS group behind China. So what does the Trump administration do? It imposes a universal tariff with China, of course, as the core country attacked more than all the rest. But everyone from Canada and Mexico to Europe to South Korea and, of course, China is attacked, presumably to save the American oligarchy, because this was done, although there are, and there were and still are, specific companies and specific billionaires and multimillionaires against the tariff regime. The fact is, Wall Street was behind Trump on this one. Okay? They supported him. Because he delivers, even if they lose something over here, he delivers on other issues like the 4.5 trillion cut in taxes and deregulation, which they demand, and huge government contracts that make the federal bureaucracies more capital intensive, less labor intensive, transferring money to Silicon Valley, to banks, consulting firms, and so forth. So this issue is against the background of economic nationalism, although just recently, a couple of days ago, one of the three rating agencies, Moody's, comes out and lowers the credit rating of the United States of public debt at 36 trillion, very likely to go far higher, by the way, especially as the Trump administration is offering trillions to people who don't need it, namely the richest 1%, trying to get something out of social programs to compensate for that. But the rating agency, this is not China doing this. This is not Iran or Russia or any of the enemies of the United States, axis of evil. This is Moody's doing this, downgrading the credit rating of the United States. Okay, the other two, Fitch and S&P, by the way, had done that already. Okay, before Trump. So this is not an issue of Trump. This is an issue this is a systemic problem. Regardless of administration, I believe either Fitch or S&P started during the Obama period, right after because of the Great Recession of 2008, I think in 2011, well, there was the first downgrade. So you have a systemic problem here. And what is it that they do to try to fix it? They tighten control of the state even more under the oligarchy and hand out even more income, transfer income even more from the social welfare state to the corporate welfare state. However, to do this, these people, contrary to what some scholars and journalists and a lot of vacuous rhetoric here, that these people don't know what they're doing, they're ignorant and all that. I don't think they're ignorant. I take them very seriously. I think they're smart people. They are doing what is in the financial interests of the elite, namely transferring income from the working class and the middle class to the richest Americans. At a time of contraction, at a time that the United States share of global GDP is declining while China is rising, at a time that in purchasing power parity, China is far ahead by several trillion, depending on whose statistics you believe, 7 to 11 trillion ahead of the United States. In nominal value, no. But very shortly, according to the International Monetary Fund, they will overtake the United States in that as well. The fact that the Trump administration caved to China is indicative that it doesn't have the leverage that the United States thought it did. So what do? They turn inward to extract more income from the working class and the middle class, and and give that to the capitalist class. That means that they follow polls, public opinion polls, and they know, as a recent Pew study, I believe it was, that shows 78% of the American people live paycheck to paycheck. So the Trump administration and the Republicans, as well as some Democrats who go along with this stuff, with these policies of neoliberalism, they know that eventually resistance will be building. When you cut social programs, you cut Medicaid, veterans benefits, just so you can strengthen capital so that it can be competitive on a world base, okay? Competitive globally. There will be resistance eventually. So how do you fight that? How do you meet authoritarianism, authoritarian policies? Greater resources for the defense sector. Next year, we're looking over $1 trillion, and for the police and prisons. So we are getting to a situation of the state under oligarchy control evolving toward authoritarianism. Again, this is not a Trump issue. When I was in higher education decades ago, I remember discussing this issue at conferences with colleagues from the University of Texas, University of Wisconsin, Harvard. We all agreed that we were headed that way. And the question that we had among ourselves in debates is, how would all of this shape up, considering that the United States was founded as a colony, was a pluralistic society, a society based on diversity. It had the issue of taking over a native population, namely the American Indians, the Native American, regimenting them, having a slave-based economy, especially in the South, segregated society. How would this society evolve under the oligarchic control of the state toward authoritarianism? That was the debate. I remember that 35 years ago or so in academic conferences. So we have now arrived at a time where Harvard, as well as the Washington Post just recently, by the way, openly discussed this, not to mention Bernie Sanders going around the country with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, talking about the oligarchy in America and how people must fight back because the state society has been taken over by this oligarchy. Now, there is a question, of course, that has concerned the American people, and that is the question of the culture surrounding this issue. Just recently, there is a great deal of concern because of the very costly, depending whose figures you accept, between $40 and $60 million for a massive parade, military parade. I believe June 14th of 2025 will take place, which is also coinciding with Trump's birthday or some personal celebration, and huge banners of the president in public buildings like the Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, which was founded by Abraham Lincoln, by the way. And that's one thing to have the huge banner of Abraham Lincoln, a historical figure associated with the Civil War, the American Civil War, a person that transcends political party identity, and associated with social justice, versus someone who is openly embracing a different sort of model of the state. And this has concerned a lot of people. Now, again, I don't blame Trump for doing this. I blame the institutional structure, because for a number of decades from Reagan to the present, what we have had is the media building up a culture of the businessman hero. The businessman hero. It's no longer people like Albert Einstein who are heroes of society, people who are devoted to social justice and science and creativity. It's the businessman. Programming on television devoted to elevating the businessman to a hero status. And what better than to have a business person coming into government and running government is with the assumption that somehow what takes place in business is the ideal for society, when in fact what takes place in business is the ideal for the private interests of that business and nothing more. Society has absolutely nothing to do with the business model. Contrary what, unfortunately, what they teach in many business schools around the world, not just in the United States, that you can transfer the business model. Well, we have transferred the business model to the state, and we have seen the result, authoritarianism, by the way. That's the result. Amassing such vast power in the hands of business people who view society as a commodity. Everything from the individual to the office of to the public office, viewed as a commodity, is a problem, because social justice doesn't enter into this. Okay, so we go back to the theory of neoliberalism, where the values of society are changed and people are asked to accept the new norm, that they are to conform to the new norm of being docile consumer citizens, not active political citizens. So the the question is, of course, when Trump goes to the Middle East and signs deals on behalf of, and takes along executives from the United States, especially Silicon Valley, and signs multi-billion-dollar deals with countries historically known for policies linked to authoritarianism. These are not open, pluralistic, diversity-based societies. Not that the Trump administration is interested in that either. And when there are personal gifts, like the gift of the Qatar airplane for 100 million to the president, and some Republicans going, well, the French gave us the Statue of Liberty. And the immediate response on the part of some Democrats, and rightly so, is you can't take the Statue of Liberty and ride it around like you can an airplane. The Statue of Liberty was given to the country, and it's in a fixed place, and it symbolizes freedom and equality and the ideals of the Atlantic revolutions. The Atlantic revolutions in history, by the way, are the American and the French Revolution. That is not the same as Qatar providing a personal gift to the President of the United States in return for favors. I want to mention something here about Qatar. This is a country, by the way, with in Europe, I know in the United States there's not much, but in Europe, the country of Qatar doesn't have exactly the best reputation, because historically they've tried to provide some, to go around the rules and the laws of Europe, the European Union, and have tried to use money, bakshish, as we call it, to secure favors through individual members of the European Parliament and so forth. Qatar has also been involved, unfortunately, in some scandals. Some newspapers and magazines have characterized it as corruption through the FIFA organization, that is the soccer league, the World Soccer League. And unfortunately, the president of the United States was dragged into that. Um, the FIFA is known, the world organization representing soccer leagues, owned usually by wealthy billionaires, oligarchs, um, individuals who are, there have been stories, launder money and use offshore betting, okay, to fix games and secure enormous profits. That is not a good image to have with a democratically elected president representing the national interest rather than specific interests. Now, again, that is a side issue, but the question here is the role of the state serving broader interests of society versus specific interests of businessmen, and the White House setting the precedent of being used, and there's been some press about this. What kind of precedent does it set when the United States announces that the White House is open for business? It's for sale, and policies for sale, foreign policy, public policies for sale, because the neoliberal model allows for the commoditization of public policy. So public policy becomes a commodity. And on behalf of and this is on behalf of the capitalist class benefiting. So there is the question of reducing public policy to a commodity and bringing individuals into the cabinet. And when you look at the individuals in the cabinet, this has nothing to do with the Trump administration cabinet officials, because Biden had some characters who come. They all come. Obama, the same thing. It doesn't matter who it is. They come from Wall Street, and they are there to serve the interest of Wall Street. But the Trump administration has especially used the office to promote cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency is invariably linked. It has a history. And this is in the mainstream media, this is in scholarly works, this is out in the open, invariably linked to money laundering, human trafficking, drug operations, illegal drug operations on a world scale, tax evasion. So it doesn't have exactly a good history. And it's interesting that a country like El Salvador promotes cryptocurrency and hosts American companies promoting that are cryptocurrency based, and the Trump administration has individuals in the cabinet linked to those companies and to the government of El Salvador, which is openly authoritarian, by the way. So what we have here is the state under oligarchic control linked to other authoritarian regimes overseas, whether in the Middle East or in Latin America, in this case in Central America and El Salvador. And the question is, what happens to the Constitution of the United States? Now, there is an emoluments clause of 1781. That emoluments clause was based, the first country in the world, by the way, to adopt an emoluments clause forbidding public officials from accepting gifts, bribes, whatever, from foreign elements, was based on the Dutch model. Holland was the first country in the world in 1651 to adopt an emoluments clause. The United States 1781 emoluments clause in the Constitution, by the way, this is a legal issue, is based on the Dutch model. The question, of course, is one where the idea is to prevent public officials from being susceptible to bribes and reduce public policy to a commodity. However, the neoliberal model promotes public policy as a commodity, as it promotes everything. Everything in the neoliberal model, including human beings, by the way, commoditized by social media, their personal data used as a commodity. Okay, so what we have here is the neoliberal model systemically brings this, obviates the emoluments clause. So the emoluments clause doesn't mean anything for the Trump administration because, and in some case, I want to make sure I present this correctly. I'm not excusing the Trump administration, but the fact is, in some respects, I was listening to some of his debates back in 2016 with Hillary Clinton when she was running against him. And then, of course, more recently. The fact is, he's right in some respects that the system, well, you don't like this, write a law to obviate, to end it. The system breeds this sort of thing. So Trump is right. The system breeds it. I don't believe in cult of personality, although he tries to breed that cult of personality himself. Obviously, when you have portraits of yourself in public buildings out there in Washington, D.C., you're building a cult of personality. But it is a systemic issue. The emoluments clause is there because it wants to protect the welfare of the citizens as a whole, as a body, from corruption and from outside elements having access to influence in government by paying bribes. Why would anyone give $400 million plane to any head of state? In this case, it's Trump. Okay. By the way, the interesting thing about the Qatari government was when they were asked about this issue, we don't see what the problem is. It's a gift. Well, okay, it's a $400 million gift. In any case, the UK Guardian recently had a story which it enhanced that story with a public opinion poll where it showed that the majority of the American people do recognize that indeed the state is under oligarchic control, served by a regime, by government that serves that oligarchy as well as itself, its family interests. There are estimates, by the way, that even before the Middle East trip, the Trump family fortune had grown by $2 billion because the Trump family has investments in crypto coin, by $2 billion between the time they announced, the time that the elections were announced back in November 2024 until end of April. It's now estimated over $3 billion in net gains since November. So we're talking about enormous amounts of money, and the question is, the average human being, let alone the average American, doesn't make that kind of money because they don't have anything to leverage. They don't have the White House to leverage. So the White House, which is the house of the people, it is a public office, is being used as a commodity for private profit. This, in my view, I don't want to mislead anyone. I'm not defending anybody, but it is really stands to reason this would happen under the neoliberal model, which privatizes everything. There's no public anything. This is why there are neoliberal scholars who have argued that we are back into a neo-feudal era. During the age of feudalism and manorialism for 1,000 years in Western Europe, in Western Christendom, there was no such thing as public property. The monarch owned what the monarch owned, and public property was the private domain. Everything was private, the state included. The public assets were the assets of the monarchy, okay? Private. The other element that, and unfortunately, neoliberalism has quite a bit to do with that kind of mindset. Private. Everything is privatized. Unfortunately, another element to this is, again, going back to history, in the age of absolutism from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, there was an era in economic policy called mercantilism, where the state basically directed the course of the economy, tried to achieve a balance of power surplus, exactly like Trump is doing, and favored certain companies over others, gave contracts to certain companies for mining, for example, trade routes, okay? And we are now in an era of neo-mercantilism. The tariff policies that the United States tried has failed so far. In my view, by the way, no matter what the press is, has failed, considering Trump is now going after Walmart, telling them, eat the losses. Don't pass on the rises to the consumer. Of course, Walmart is going to pay. Why is Walmart in business? It's a company that's there to. They're not a charity. They're a for-profit company. Of course, they're going to pay. Tariffs means a tax on the consumer. Walmart is going to do what it's going to do, and that is pass on to the pay it. You want to buy this shirt made in China? Pay 145% more for it. Okay, that's how it works. So we're now in a phase where the contradictions in capitalism are such that they're undermining the capitalist system. Okay. Within the capitalist system, smaller businesses, by the way, not to mention the working class and the middle class, are suffering. When a country has, and Trump has accepted this statistic, 78% of the American people living paycheck to paycheck, and only 22% are not, that's a problem. That's a problem, especially given the IMF projections for GDP growth for this year, with still a possibility of recession this year, and lacking the prospects for growth down the road. So what we have is a serious problem within the capitalist system in crisis. There was evidence that the capitalist system was in crisis with the this savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, the late 1980s, the second Reagan administration, then the internet bubble in the late 90s, then the Great Recession of 2008, then the IMF austerity, European Union austerity imposition in a number of periphery countries in the 2010s, and even Obama, who was supposedly in favor of social justice and decried, supposedly, state control of the oligarchy, admitted during his campaign in 2012 re-election that the benefits, the vast majority of the benefits, the overwhelming benefits, derived from the recovery of the 2008 which meant huge corporate subsidies, bailouts of banks and insurance companies by the state, taxpayer money, by the way, he concluded those went to the richest 1%. And this is Obama. Okay? This is not Trump. This is Obama that did this. Now, the question for the future is, where is America headed under what the Harvard University study, Oligarchy Out in the Open, points out? A recent study found that the average chief executive officer pay in the United States pay package, by the way, is $41.4 million. That same study found that the average worker in America makes $55,000 versus $41.4 million for a chief executive officer. This is a 746 to 1 ratio. One of the reasons studies that have compared China to the United States economic trends in the last 35 years and why China has moved so far ahead is precisely because of this income disparity. This is not the fault of Iran or Russia or China or anyone except the model of neoliberalism, which concentrates capital. And instead of addressing the gross economic inequality, which a number of senators and congressmen have already said as much, by the way, and especially now that the bill for 4.5 trillion is on the table, and they're talking about cutting $1 trillion from Medicare, cutting veterans of their school lunch programs, gutting all kinds of programs, including science programs, by the way, which help society as a whole, especially businesses, which is mind-boggling for me, but in any case. This is a serious issue. How do you deal with something like this? How do you deal with this? You pour more money in defense and police. You create a militarized police state. You become more authoritarian. And to inculcate the idea that this is the norm. By the way, we have elections. Elections equate with democracy. They don't, of course. The word democracy, like the word oligarchy, is a classical Greek, which means democracy means rule by the people. There is no rule by the people. There is rule by the oligarchy, exactly as Senator Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Kennedy School of the Harvard's Kennedy School and the Washington Post and others have said. This is what's going on. By the way, the Washington Post is owned by one of the oligarchs in the United States. So what we have is the realization that society is under this oligarchic control, and that eventually, especially if economic hard times, and that will be the case at some point, there will be another great recession like 2008. What happens then? What happens then? Well, the way to deal with it, obviously, is to get as far away from this model of political economy as possible. The other way that they are dealing with it, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, is militarized police state solutions. And that is really the essence of the problem. The essence is what kind of society is evolving in the United States. Is it one based on the liberal democratic principles of the 18th century when America was founded, right? It was created? Is it on the basis of those ideals, or is it on the basis of open oligarchy, as the Kennedy School study stressed. And it is unfortunate that the situation, regardless of the midterm elections, because a lot of people, by the way, well, just wait until the midterm elections of 2026 next year, and there will be a change. And Democrats may take over the Senate, may take over the House. I don't know that they will, but they may. What difference will that make to the state under oligarchy? Even if Trump loses in 2028, what difference will that make? Considering that Trump was not in office between 21 and 25, January 21, January 25, he was a Democrat. And what happened is that Democrats had an opportunity to become truly democratic. That is the party of the working class and the middle class. But instead, they continued on the course of being a party of Wall Street and the military industrial complex. That's why Trump won. So it isn't the fault of one person. He's the manifestation of a deeper systemic problem that cannot be fixed by blaming Canada. How is Canada's fault that the United States is cutting $1 trillion out of Medicare? Why is Canada to blame? And so just put tariffs on them so that the mass consumer can subsidize the tax cuts the richest Americans. Okay, all of this is diversion, it's distraction. I thank you for listening. I ask you to write comments and join this channel. I will be delighted to have you join us. It's a channel devoted to scholarly academic approach to issues, not populism. Certainly only strictly based on empirically verified, evidenced issues. Thank you very much.